I might start, even though we've still got a couple of people coming along. Hi everyone. My name is Kylie Hansen. I'm from Impact Seed, and I want to welcome you to the webinar today on impact management for corporates and for corporate social responsibility. And before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I know that a lot of you are joining from other lands and in sometimes different time frames. I think it's always interesting when we have Eastern States people joining on WA time, because we had a couple of emails this morning about, hey, wasn't it starting at 10 a.m? Yes, but WA time. So I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that all of you are joining us from today as well. So before we kick off, I just want to acknowledge a couple of other things and frame, I guess, the workshop that we have on this morning. So the first thing, which is probably going to be quite clear, is that it's not a COVID-19 oriented workshop. So I think we've all seen a plethora of those sort of popping up lately of talking about the different things that we do in the context of COVID-19 and the global health pandemic. It's really important, obviously, and we've done that too at Impact Seed. But today we're focused a bit more just on, I guess, getting back to basics in terms of impact management and how some of those concepts can apply specifically for corporates and in a corporate setting. So this is part one of two parts, I suppose, of a workshop. We'd originally planned this pre-coronavirus as a face-to-face workshop. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So the webinar is effectively framing some of the key concepts, and we hope to then hold in August or maybe later a workshop face-to-face, which actually brings together two different webinars that I'm holding today, one for organisations and focused on organisational impact, and this one that's focused a bit more on corporate environment, corporate investment, and that sort of side of impact. So I will make sure that when we send the slides out to you later, that we keep you informed about that second workshop, if that's something you're interested in attending with us. So it's not a perfect delineation, just to be clear. I'm trying to divide out organisational impact and I guess a corporate impact, or the investment into a series of different organisations by a corporate. Not quite an easy delineation. So there's a little bit of overlap between the sessions. I know some of you are joining us for both, but I suppose just to give you that context, that's what I've tried to do in terms of the content that I've got, is to focus more on a corporate and a corporate setting, and looking at corporate investment and how we might measure the impact of that. I guess I would also just encourage you to think about the workshop as being part of developing your practice. So I think some of what I say will be familiar to some of you and some of it might not be. And I think impact measurement and management is a practice, and like anything else, we just got to, gather the knowledge and information that we can and keep working on it. So I guess don't treat it as this is the way to measure and manage impact in a corporate setting. It's more about, here's some tools and tricks and frameworks and ideas, and they might help you. So take from them what you will. And the last thing, please do ask questions all the way through. So I do tend to probably over deliver. I really like giving content. I want to tell you everything I know. But yeah, if you do have questions as we go, please just ask them. The chat is probably the best way of doing it. I've got an eye on that. And so if I see some questions coming through, I will jump onto those. And if we cover the content a bit later, I'll just raise that as we go. So I think that's all of the kind of opening remarks I wanted to make. So we'll jump into the content. So can everyone see the screen? If we can nod for those of you that can see the screen, great, awesome. So just a little bit about Impact Seed for those that might not know about us. So we are an organisation focused specifically on building social enterprise and the impact investment market in WA. That naturally includes quite a lot of outcomes measurement. It's one of the key elements for impact investment, which is investment into things that do good and create a social financial return at the same time, is how do you measure that social return. So looking at the measurement of impact and the management of impact is something that is probably at least half of all of the work that we do. And in terms of the outline that I've got for you today, first of all, what we want to do is go back to basics. And I've got Aaron with me. He's going to go through a little bit of this sort of framing of corporate social responsibility and sustainability in a sense, and then go through some of the basic measurement concepts that we'll take all the way through. And then I've delineated the kinds of frameworks and tools I want to talk about into two different areas. So those that are around, I guess, understanding and reporting change, and those that are more oriented towards transparency. And that will include what is a B-Corp, for those of you that might not be aware what that terminology is. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we use frameworks to organize. So there's a whole bunch of different frameworks, including the Sustainable Development Goals and including some of the frameworks that we'll talk to, that are really useful to effectively help organize and articulate impact. So I just want to talk a little bit about those. And then if there's any additional questions, we will wrap up after that. So I think I'll hand over to Aaron now. You're mute.
Hey, it's great to be on the call today, and there's great to see some familiar names in the lineup, including people I have worked with very closely in this space. And I guarantee that Kylie's content is continually relevant and continually makes me think. And I have been through the presentation and worked with her for a little while, so hopefully you'll get something out of it as well. By way of background, I've managed this piece of work with large corporates and small not-for-profits, and I've seen partnerships from small microeconomic development in small towns to large-scale environmental and conservation programs, say traversing country borders and in partnerships with large governments. And I think without doubt the most difficult area to tackle is to provide evidence for success. Evidence for communities and stakeholders, for the project and the program and the partnerships, and then trying to create a cumulative view of positive impact across all of the CSR activities. And also, and I think in my practitioner world, navigating the many academic theories and approaches available and making a decision about what to use. And I really think the key differentiator, especially in a post-COVID-19 environment, is being able to demonstrate and articulate the positive impact your company or your CSR program has had. So what's the so what? What actually happened? What worked? What didn't work? And what are the lasting outcomes? And I think what's going to separate the rhetoric and the posturing from genuine and authentic is really being able to build long-term view of what actual CSR outcomes the business is delivering, and this will build business value and reputation. I still think there's an overwhelming amount of jargon and terminology that goes with this space. And I suppose if we start with this slide one, this is a singular view of what corporate social responsibility is, and I don't think it's the only view. But a couple of things to note on this slide is having a look at what is included in corporate social responsibility, and thinking about what outcomes you would be looking for in each area and how would you measure it. So I think if you look here at this particular viewpoint takes in sponsorship, sincerity, I'm not sure how you're measuring that, social responsibility, ethics, integrity, and sustainability is very much a subset of the whole of corporate responsibility. And I find that these are quite often interchangeable words and interchangeable terms. So I think that's something to think about as we go through the rest of the presentation. Next slide, Kylie. I thought it was worth going back to where CSR began, and I think this is a good timeline here because originally I think corporate social responsibility was simply a coping strategy and organisations trying to control damage post it occurring, or being able to have a narrative around what they did. And I think in the 80s, it was still very reactive and it was very much compliance. I'll give you some time to read the slide a little bit. And I think in the 1990s and 2010s, and I think when I began to work in this area, there was some more proactivity and some more understanding about environmental and social strategies within organisations. But I still think it was very difficult to bed these areas into the main areas of business, and I think it was considered a nice to do rather than a must do. And I think now we're in the 2020s, there is increased legislation and compliance, so there is a lot of must do. It's accepted and expected, but I think there's increased focus on trying to understand the so what and what is delivered, and I think there is a lot of kudos to be gained for delivering beyond compliance. Sorry, next slide. So I think also just keeping in the back of your mind what is CSR and what is sustainability and what happens in your organisation or from your lens or from your piece of work. Because I think sometimes they're used interchangeably, but I think it's really important to understand that CSR is a very big beast and a very big content area, and that sustainability is a part of that. And quite often I've noticed in places that I've worked, it's very much delineated within organisations as well. So you don't always have the opportunity to bring the sustainability practice into your measurement, and that is something to think about. I think the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals have started to tease out within an organisation around where sustainability fits with corporate social responsibility, but I still think there's a little way to go there. And I think there's going to be an increasing breadth of areas that are included in corporate social responsibility. So political landscape, occupational groups, diversity, culture, physiology, there's some examples there. So I thought it was worth zooming right out and having a look at the overall space. And I think I've got one more slide to talk to. And I think definitely shifting CSR from discretionary to integral is the challenge, and making it part of the boardroom conversation, making it part of the management conversation, and making sure people understand the benefits of doing it properly. I think assessing, measuring, understanding, and being able to articulate the value is going to be important. And I think understanding the internal benefits, the cultural benefits, the employee benefits, and the external benefits, customer loyalty and reputation is important. And also it's really important, I think what Kylie's information that she's going to present will demonstrate, it needs to be fit for purpose, and there is no one size that fits all, or one approach that fits all. So that's something I really think you should take away from today's conversation. So over to you, Kylie.
Thanks, Erin. So just a reminder, if anyone has questions as we go, please do feel free to type them into the chat. Oftentimes people have their videos on, so they kind of just wave if they've got a question, but I know most of you have chosen not to do that, which is fine. But in which case, please do, please do just type into the chat if you've got a question as we go. Okay, so the first point I guess I'm going to make is around making sure we have clarity about what we're measuring. So I think oftentimes when we come to outcomes measurement or management, and I'll talk about the kind of delineation between those in a moment, we're often not clear necessarily on what it is we're exactly trying to measure. So, you know, oh, we want to measure impact. Okay, well, what specifically within that do we want to measure? And I guess for the kinds of businesses that we're talking about, there's two kind of areas where we really do want to be measuring. One is in the product or the business model, so the actual what of what we do as a business, if that's something that is, you know, creating impact that we want to measure. And I'd argue probably everything creates an impact, positive or negative. And so we probably do want to be capturing what that impact is of what we're doing. So the example here is, you know, looking at anti-malarial bed nets distributed, affordable housing units created. So it's a bit more social enterprisey, or businesses that are focused on doing good. But whatever it is, that's the content, the product or service of your business, we can be measuring that and the impact of that. The other area where we can measuring is the way in which we do business. So the way in which we treat our employees, the way in which we are thinking about the environmental impact that we have as a business, the way in which we're thinking about what we're doing or giving back into our communities. So the way in which we do business is the other kind of thing that we can be measuring. And they're both really important to be looking at how we measure, but it's just being clear at any point in time on what it is that we're actually talking about measuring. And I often think really measurement is effectively an understanding between you and your audience about what it is you're trying to measure. And when we talk a bit more about outcomes, I think that'll become very clear that's what it's about. So in terms of framing the concepts around measurement, this model is called a program logic or a theory of change model, and the terms are used interchangeably. Often I'll ask if people are familiar with this, and I'll either get some nods or some shaking of the heads, but we'll just go with, I'm going to assume we don't know much about it, so I'm just going to go with it. So this is effectively the kind of core at the basis of when we're talking about outcomes or impact measurement. Pretty much every tool, methodology, or framework uses this kind of language. So I like to start right at the right-hand side around impact. So if we're thinking about what the biggest, longest term kind of impact that we're trying to create, you know, it's sort of vision or mission level organization type stuff. So what are the biggest level of outcomes at economic, social, environmental? What are those outcomes that we're trying to achieve? That's what we'd call long-term outcomes or impact. A step back from that then is the medium-term outcomes. So what are the changes that have to occur in behavior, in policy, in action, in decisions? What are the behavioral based changes that need to occur for us to get to those long-term outcomes and impacts? So those are medium-term outcomes. And then we've got the short-term outcomes, which are in order to get to those behavioral policy action type shifts, what kind of changes do we need to see in people's knowledge and understanding and awareness? And what do we need to see in terms of attitudes and skills and opinions? So you can kind of see in any context then, whatever change we're trying to create or see or measure, you can kind of bound it within that, right? So you can create a little, you know, theory of change that if we have these types of shifts in knowledge, understanding, skill, opinion, we can have these kinds of shifts in behavior, action, policy, which will lead to these longer term outcomes and impacts that we're ultimately trying to achieve. So that's kind of the short, medium, long-term outcomes of the program logic or the theory of change. The other stuff's all, you know, really important, but the language around it and I guess the framing of it is really what's important. I think where you put the things beyond the outcomes is probably up to you, really. So you've got the inputs, the stuff that you invest and that we invest into the program or the service or, you know, whatever it is that we're trying to understand and measure, how those inputs are applied. So that is the activities. And here in this particular model, the activities are listed as an output. It's not always the case. Sometimes you've got inputs, activities, and then outputs, but it's just kind of different models. And so the activities, so that's the what we do, which is the workshops. How many workshops are we running? You know, how many people are attending? You know, how many partners do we have? What kinds of assessments did we do? So it's the stuff that we did. And then the outputs of those are what actually happened. So who did we reach? How many participants were there? What physical things came out of it? Did we develop a resource? Was the partnership actually not an input, but was the partnership actually an output of the kind of activity that we did? And so on and so forth. So the theory of change then links these things together. So why is it that if we use these inputs in this kind of way, so we apply them in these kinds of activities, we get these kinds of outputs? And then why is it that these kinds of outputs will lead to these short, medium, and long-term outcomes? And that theory of change hopefully is informed by evidence, but it isn't always. But just being aware and I guess cognizant of being able to talk to, well, what is the theory of change that underpins the reason why we apply our resources in these kinds of ways? And why, I guess, then we have these kinds of outcomes. So that's the theory of change or program logic model. And as you'll see with some of the frameworks that we're going to go through, that language of outcomes and short, medium, long-term outcomes generally underpins most of the other frameworks. And in fact, I don't know if I have it here to speak to, but No, I don't. But in fact, there was some research done internationally about impact investment, so impact investors and fund managers, and what kind of language they use. And it was overwhelmingly found that actually they'll use different frameworks and tools, but overwhelmingly they'll use that language of outcomes. So, you know, outputs or activities, outputs, and short, medium, long-term outcomes. So the impact management project. So this speaks to why I tried to frame this workshop as impact management. So you've probably heard both phrases, measurement and management. I think management really refers to how not only are we just understanding what's happening with our activities and our work, but how are we actually doing something about it? Measurement kind of indicates, okay, well, we've measured it and we're watching it and we're kind of seeing what's happening, but what are we actually doing about it? Whereas impact management is a little bit more active than that. It's like, how are we using this information that we've gleaned to actually, you know, either stop creating the negative impact that we now see we're having, or start to create the kind of positive impact that we want to be having. And so the impact management framework or project is actually an international, I guess, another framework, or it's probably a framework. It has some tools and methodologies as a part of it. And there's a lot of organizations signed on to how we use this framework. And so it's got two key elements. The first part is the intentions. So it kind of frames intentions of impact into 4 areas. So we don't consider impacts, so we might be aware of what potential negative impact looks like, but we're not doing anything necessarily to mitigate it. And then you've got in the red circle there, looking to avoid harm. So I guess we might want to talk about this as, you know, socially responsible investment, or being, you know, ethical investment, or activities. So we know we have requirements to meet and we want to mitigate risk and behave responsibly, but we might not be actively looking to create impact at that point. Then we've got the yellow circle, so that is wanting to benefit people and planet, so looking for positive impacts, either social or environmental. And then the little orange one is actually contributing to solutions, so actually not just at a community or people or particular kind of issue level, but I'm wanting to, you know, solve some kind of challenge. And we find a lot of social enterprises will exist in that contribute to solutions, I guess, circle. But I think businesses operate, you know, right across that spectrum, right? So this particular diagram is taken from a Dutch pension manager, PGGM. And so what they have then done is mapped their business goals across those intentions, and the what, how much, who, contribution and risk. That's the 5 elements of impact that the impact management project uses. So you can see what they've done here is taken the intentions behind the IMP, mapped it against the dimensions of the IMP, and what they then do is actually map their investments and the work that they do across all of those areas. So it's like, I think the IMP as a framework is really getting legs. Like, it's got a lot more organizations behind it now. There's a lot more knowledge, and I guess I'm talking more in the impact investment area, but there's a lot more understanding of the project and a lot more people and organizations and fund managers using it. And I think that the language is getting really consistent, and it's quite useful to just be aware of and have a look at their resources, as they're quite simple and easy to use. We will make the slides available. I've just had a couple of extra questions. Yes, so we will definitely make the slides available to you all. I'll send it out afterwards. Well, okay, the second point I want to make about outcomes is that the context is really critical. So I think, so you know, we talked before about the logic model. Oftentimes those outcomes, there's a lot of, and I guess I'm speaking probably a bit more from a community services lens at the moment, or actually an impact investment too. There's a lot of, oh no, that's not an outcome, or that's an output, or that's not a long-term outcome, that's just an activity, or whatever it is. There's a lot of, I guess, debate and argument about outcomes and what they are and where they fit. I think part of that is because we're not usually clear on what context we're talking about. So outcomes can operate at a whole bunch of different contexts. I mean, we've just seen short, medium and long-term outcomes, right? But there's also outcomes that happen at individual level. So what people or individuals want for themselves in their own lives, at a program or service level, and particularly, I guess, for those of you that have corporate investment programs, like at I guess, an investment or a fund level. So looking at the outcomes you're trying to create amongst a bunch of different organizations. And then at a community or population level. So, you know, what are we trying to achieve for the people living in Roebourne? Or, you know, what are we trying to achieve for people with experiencing mental health challenges living in Serpentine? So there's community and population level outcomes as well. And I think oftentimes when people are discussing or debating, arguing about what's outcomes and what's outputs, we're just not being clear enough about what context we're talking about. And so that's just a note to make. And it just goes back to what I said before about oftentimes talking about outcomes measurement is an understanding between you and the audience about what it is you're trying to understand and measure. And once you have that shared understanding and the shared language about what it is you're trying to understand, the actual measurement of it becomes a lot easier. Okay. Oh, so I did have this slide. I spoke to this just before, but I did have it in here. So once we can articulate outcomes, I guess the actual measurement side of it comes to when we apply indicators to those outcomes that help us understand what change is happening within them. So this is that study I spoke to that found that investors are generally pretty content to use the language of outputs, outcomes, and impact. So in order to actually look at measuring, we need to be attaching indicators to those outcomes. And this slide just gives you a little bit of a sense of what I think is reasonable in terms of what kinds of indicators or numbers of indicators that you might attach to outcomes. Again, you know, it's a bit, how long is a piece of string? Because this stuff is highly contextual, but I think generally if you're looking at long-term outcomes, if you're going to be understanding the movement of 1 to 3 indicators around those long-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes, if you've got a selection of 3 to 5, you might not be measuring them all really intensely, but you've got an understanding of the shifts amongst those and what impact it's having. And then obviously being able to map your long and short-term outcomes to the activities that are actually happening. And for each outcome, we need to have a look at having those indicators attached to it, what may be a performance target for each indicator, not necessary, but, you know, useful to have. A data source or more than one data source for each indicator, and what kind of plan we have for collecting the data. And usually that involves some kind of population level analysis. So looking at some of the, you know, ABS and kinds of data banks that we have out there, usually includes some kind of surveying or interviewing or focus groups of participants or attendees or, you know, people who are engaging, stakeholders, and sometimes involves a little bit of observational analysis as well. But if there's a plan to collect the data about each of those elements, they're kind of the key parts to be able to put the bare bones of an impact measurement or management strategy in place. Any questions? No questions coming through. That's okay. Please, if you do have any, just put them on the chat. I've still got the chat here and I'm keeping an eye on it. So in terms of talking about how we measure change in indicator, because this is effectively getting to the crux of measuring outcomes, right? So once we've articulated the outcomes, and I'm giving a flyover, everyone, like, you know, we can spend days on the actual detail of this stuff. I'm really just giving you the high level understanding of how we go about doing this work, just to, I guess, get the consistent and shared language and stuff around it. But talking about how we measure change in an indicator, so the top of the pyramid here is looking at those things that are, I guess, traditionally considered more robust. No, that's probably it, just robust. I think that's a whole other conversation that we could have about what is robust evidence or data, but that's not for now, right? That's for some other time. So actually, I'll start at the bottom of the pyramid. So first of all, there's no comparison. So let's say you have articulated the kinds of outcomes that you want to achieve as a company, or as a company that's looking to invest. You've got your social investment kind of criteria or outcomes that you're looking to invest in. And you kind of come along and understand what's happening with those indicators, but with no comparison to make to it. So it's probably, that's the least robust or good way, I guess, of measuring. And an example of this would be, I will send an evaluation to all of you guys after this workshop, and I will ask, I will ask, well, I won't do this because this is a bad way of doing it, right? But say I asked you, you know, has your understanding changed, or what's your understanding of outcomes measurement now after the webinar, and give a 0 to 10 kind of thing. And you go 8. But I haven't asked you what was your understanding about outcomes before you came into the webinar. And I haven't asked, are there other things maybe that could have impacted on your understanding around outcomes? So there's no comparator, right? There's no comparison as to, you know, what actually has happened as a result of you attending the webinar. And oftentimes, I think particularly if I think about a lot of community service organizations that I work with, sometimes there isn't a comparison. So the easiest comparison that we have is the next step up, the historical baseline. So if we can compare the impact of the activity that we've done against what that person was when they came into the program or service or whatever it was. So if actually when I sent this evaluation, I said to you, how has your understanding of outcomes changed from before the webinar? So, you know, a Likert scale, very significantly, not that much, blah, blah, blah. That's a little bit of comparison. The better version would have been sending you an evaluation of, a survey before the webinar and one after, because that gets a little bit more of a sense of comparison. But often what happens in community services is we don't ask people who are experiencing vulnerability or disadvantage, before I start giving you this service, let me ask you some questions about your mental health. Like that's just not something that community services do. So oftentimes having that comparison to that person's own previous outcomes is really challenging. So baseline. If we can compare with outcomes of other cohorts, so something that we can sometimes do is compare what's happened for people that we're working with or trying to create an impact for. How do we compare that with, say, what publicly available statistics tell us about those cohorts in those areas? So, you know, you can use ABS or the Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing. Like there's a bunch of kind of different publicly available data sets that might be useful, but it really depends on what it is you want to understand. So that's historical baseline, having some kind of comparator that's, you know, and that's relatively easy, and it's better than having no comparison at all. Propensity score matching is where you have, people who are matched so the people that you are working with, or the organisation you funded has worked with, are matched with people of a similar demographic and similar background in a different cohort. So it's a little bit similar to historical baseline, but you know who the people are that you're matching them to. So it's a little bit more certain, a little bit more robust. And then we've got randomised control trial, which you may be familiar with. That happens in the kind of more health and pharmaceutical type sectors, where some people get, you know, the intervention and some people get a placebo. And so that's a very historically considered very robust way of understanding change and how a change of someone's program compares to another one. I think oftentimes we do operate in the areas of no comparison and historical baseline, and that's okay. I think the key thing is being clear and transparent about that's what we're doing. So even no comparison, so I've worked with some organisations where we haven't had a clear comparison because we haven't had a baseline. It wasn't measured before the work started, and there wasn't really a good way to find another sort of group of people to compare to. And I think it's just really important to be transparent about, yeah, like we don't know what we're comparing to, but, you know, this is where we're at and this is what we're thinking. Okay, so that's mostly the framing concepts before I kind of delve into the reporting frameworks and tools. Are there any questions before we move on? No? Okay. It's nice. I can see Erica and Amanda. They're the only two that have left their video on. So at least, oh, hey, Amelia's there too. So at least when they nod or shake, you know, I can kind of get a sense of what's going on. Okay. So talking about reporting frameworks and tools for measuring change. So as I mentioned before, I've divided the description of these tools into two areas. So These ones around measuring change are about understanding what change is happening. So kind of like the indicator conversation we just had. The reporting frameworks and tools for transparency are all those things that look at how you as a business can say you do what you're doing, right? So it's not accreditation as such, it's too strong of a word, but it's, you know, just being transparent about the things that we say we're doing. Change though. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to touch on them to give you a sense of the different kinds of tools and frameworks that exist. So in terms of the ones around measuring change, we've got social return on investment. This one is one that people have often heard of. So social return on investment effectively, and I'm going down to a program level here, right? So an organizational program level. So for a particular project or organization, it effectively gives you a dollar value for every dollar invested into that program, it is generating $3.61 of social return. There's a lot of things that can be said about SROI. I think in certain circumstances it can be a really useful tool. I do think that there's some challenges associated with reducing the kind of work that we do to a dollar value, but I do acknowledge that it is really useful in some circumstances. And, you know, effectively it pulls down all of these really complex, nuanced elements in thinking about how we measure impact to something that is very concrete and consistent and is effectively the one consistent measure that we have as a society, a dollar. And, you know, we can make comments about the appropriateness or the, about that later, but that's effectively what SROI does. Results-based accountability is a method that a lot of community service organisations use, particularly larger ones. So those of you that might be familiar with organisations like Anglicare, I'm not sure if Uniting Care uses it anymore, but there's, you know, we call them the Care Bears, so they're very large kind of not-for-profit community service organisations. It's really good because a lot of the materials are freely available, but it is, in my experience, most organisations that have used RBA have some sort of paid staff engaged to enable it across the organisation. So anyway, what it does is it effectively measures three things. What did we do? How well did we do it? And is anyone better off? And the thing I like really about RBA is that it really makes very crystal clear this element of quality. So in some other outcomes measurement frameworks, it's a little challenging, or the emphasis on quality is a little bit lost in the kind of trying to get to the end measurement or the measuring of outcomes. RBA makes this idea of quality of service really clear. And then the London benchmarking group model, which we will actually speak to. I popped that one in there because I assumed it would be one that some of you might be familiar with. And effectively it does measure change, and I can see how it measures change, but I think the degree to which it measures change is very dependent on how it's implemented within the particular organisation. But we'll come back to that in a moment. And the ones I'll go through around transparency are the Global Reporting Initiative, GIRS, which is a Global Impact Investment Report System, which is actually used by a couple of different frameworks, including those who administer the B Corporation certification, and IRIS, so the Impact Reporting and Investment Standards. And I've actually got a web page I want to show you on IRIS. So that's what we're going to go through for the rest of the session. And so just to highlight that of these tools of measuring, there's no one way of measuring outcomes. You know, there's no golden goose, I don't know, is that the right word? There's no holy grail. It's more a bunch of different tools, methodologies, approaches that you can kind of pull in and use based on the kind of context that you're in. So I often describe myself as I've just forgotten, but agnostic as to methodology, methodologically agnostic, that's right, because I don't really endorse one methodology or tool over another. I like to pull the elements that are useful based on what kind of context we're working in. And so what this slide is trying to articulate is that some of these tools, methodologies, frameworks are really useful in some phases of a project or organisation or strategy, and some are not. So for example, if we think about the logic model that we went through before, It's really good for understanding or for estimating impact and planning for impact. So, you know, if you map out and articulate the outcomes either at an organizational level or at, you know, a fund or investment kind of level, it's quite good for articulating that. But unless you attach other things to it, so unless you attach the indicators we talked about and do those other things and wrap around the logic model, you can't use it to monitor or evaluate impact. And that's kind of what this diagram is saying. So SROI, pretty good for estimating impact. So you can do it, you know, prior to starting a project, and to monitor and evaluate impact. But it's not really good for planning impact through strategy, because it's just, at the end of the day, it's a, you know, it's something that's dollars in, dollars out, right? That's kind of the output you get from SROI. And equally, the quasi-experimental and experimental methods are quite good for being able to estimate impacts. That's, you know, we take the research as a result of that kind of work. The research can inform us as to what kind of impact we think we'll have, and we can evaluate impact at the other end, but it's not really any good for planning impact or for monitoring impact as we go throughout the project or service. Oh, John's got a good comment in the chat, everyone. Have a look at that. I don't think it's a question, but I think it's a really good point. Yeah. And I agree. I think that's, I think people often gravitate towards SROI because they think that that's the language of government, or that's the language that people understand is money. I think sometimes that's true. But I think the other point, which John kind of makes, is that even if we can sometimes put it in the language that people want to see it or hear it, or we think they want to see it and hear it, it doesn't always necessarily make the difference we're hoping it will make. So making sure that, you know, the kind of way that we're measuring is something that works for us, and that we can make sure we use with ourselves and our investees or whoever it is. I think that's probably the really important thing. But thanks, John, for taking the time to comment. And encourage still questions if there's any. So the London Benchmarking Group, I probably spoke a little bit to this before, so I might let Erin speak to it because she's also used this as a framework. The only other thing I would quickly note is that you can see that it uses the inputs, outputs, outcomes, logic model type language, and also that it is really more a standard of corporate community investment. I know we've got a couple of people from other sectors on the call, so it really is more focused on corporate community investment. Erin, do you want to speak to your experience?
Yeah, I'd love to. And for those of you who know me in the call, you know that I look at everything from a helicopter viewpoint, and Kylie very much is very clever in the detail. So I hope the content today is blowing your mind somewhat, because there's a lot of concepts to get through. I think she does a great job, but I think there will be some digest required even on the content to date. I think that LBG, which is now called LBG, Corporate Citizenship, I think those of you in Western Australia know that Woodside subscribe to this model, and it's really a membership, a paid membership-based model, and the approach is to only use their framework. And the benefit is you get to have independent, auditable outcomes and measurements, so you are compared with peers or other corporates. And I think that's a big attraction when it's around the community investment. It's also because it's independent and it seems auditable. I think the downside to it, in my opinion, is that it is expensive. It is a singular framework, which is the opposite of where Kylie's commentary is coming from now, where it's very much, well, a bit like an SROI. You have to run it in a singular sort of paradigm, and I think it's probably quite resource intensive as well. And I know some of my colleagues and peers are on the call. I'm not sure how much Woodside has is using it currently, but it's definitely it's a marquee kind of model in terms of reputation and reporting as well. I think there's a bit of kudos with being part of that. It's probably that's I probably won't talk about the actual detail of the model. That's more of a Kylie place.
I don't think I'm taking the time to take about the detail of anything, guys. We're just doing a flying run through a couple of frameworks. Okay, I'll keep going, but I just want to keep emphasizing I did make time for any questions you have. So please, feel free to type those in. Okay, so I'm taking a slightly different turn now to talk about those of you on the call that do undertake corporate investments. So I was trying to balance between thinking about those things that are relevant for you to measure and think about as a corporate, right? But then also if you are engaging in corporate investment, social investment, whatever we might call it. So there's just a couple of slides here to talk to this side of it. So I think when we're talking about corporate investment, then there's two key questions, right? So there's what impact can, oh, sorry, just having a slight technical thing. So there's what impact can have the organizations that we've actually invested in made, and can we understand and meaningfully aggregate that up to understand the impact at a whole of fund level? And secondly, then what is my impact as an investor in that, or investing, I'm using investing in the kind of wrong way here, but as a corporate investor, what kind of impact can be attributed to the role that I played, and what role did my capital, applying it as and when I did, what role did that make to the overall impact? And these ones are really challenging questions, right? And so there's ways that we can, estimate and make assumptions and kind of get an answer to these kinds of questions, but it is challenging. But I think it's important to be clear about these are probably the questions we're wanting to understand if we're thinking about impact in the context of our corporate investment programs. So I have a few principles I would talk to in this. So if we're talking about aggregating and attributing impact, then the first one I would think is important is a consistent but not necessarily a standardized approach. I think standardized approaches can be problematic, because if you're looking to invest in those things that are really going to make an impact in the areas that you care about and in the communities you care about, it's unlikely they're going to be programs that are similar to one another. And so a standardized approach to measurement is not going to be particularly useful in that context. So being able to use the bare bones, right? So come back to the outcomes, activities, short, medium, long-term outcomes, and attaching indicators to those. And hopefully they're consistent indicators across some of those investments. But if they're not, at least we've got that bare bones mapping, right? So we've got that, the infrastructure to be able to hang off the outcomes approach at least, and create a narrative about the connections between those investments. So consistent approach is important, not necessarily standardized. I think culture and buy-in really matters. And certainly in a couple of projects we've looked at recently, the quality and consistency of that data is really important. And there is something here I would relate back to COVID. I think there's some real challenges in what I've seen around organizations measuring during COVID. Some of them are going nuts, and we're seeing, loads more measurement, probably over measuring than what we've seen previously, because people are like, I want to understand the impact of this and what does it mean for, our planning, our investment, our services, and, let's collect as much data as possible, probably without being super strategic about what kind of data we're collecting. But then also there's people who just have no capacity to do anything because they're dealing with the global health pandemic. And so there's organizations, I think, that have probably let a lot of their really good practices fall to one side. And so there's going to be a real gap in terms of the data that's being collected over time. So the culture and buy-in element of this is partly the investees, or actually it's almost entirely the investees. So those organizations who you are wanting to collect the data to understand what impact you're having on the organization, their literacy and capacity to engage in analysis of that data is really important. Their understanding of why you're asking the data for that data is really important. And ideally, if we can get to this point, I'm working on this at the moment with some community service organizations and the state government, if we can get to a point where the data we're collecting is as useful for the investees as it is for the investor, then that is really powerful. So that makes it more likely the organizations are going to have buy-in to collect that data. They'll make sure the data is quality, and they'll make sure that they do it consistently. If that buy-in doesn't exist around it, and if it's just for the investor that they're collecting the information and they don't understand where it's going, generally the quality of the data is much poorer. And so the best the best outcomes framework and the best methodologies for measuring in the world can't overcome the issues around the quality of the data. Being transparent about assumptions. So every single organization, investor, program that's ever measured has to make assumptions about certain things, whatever it is. And so I think being really clear and transparent about assumptions is important. It's one of the things I actually quite like about social return on investment, or SROI. It's very clear about the importance of transparency and assumptions, because then anyone can pick up that analysis and interrogate it, and to understand why you've used that data in this way, and why have you made that assumption, etc. So yeah, being really transparent over assumptions and not overstating them is critical. And there's a couple of other principles from the impact management project, and this speaks to that second question around how, as an investor or a financier, how can I attribute impact to what I've been able to do as an investor? And I want to be clear that this is very much more an impact investment lens on this, but I think there's some really good principles for thinking about it as philanthropists, as corporate investors, as high net worth investors even. But the three kind of key areas that that IMP kind of say that investors provide are signaling that impact matters. So the way in which they give money signals that that kind of impact is important, or that impact as a whole is important. Engaging actively, so being more than money, so being networks or time or whatever else it is. Growing new or undersupply capital markets, noting that this is more this is an international framework that's obviously applying over developing countries as well. We can probably interpret that more as how we're supporting those areas that perhaps don't get the kind of investment that they might necessarily need for whatever reason, and providing flexible capital. So this is, I guess, in a corporate investment, in an impact investment context, that's more around patient loans, very low market rate returns. Sorry, that's a oxymoron, whatever the word is. We don't have low market rate returns, well, kind of do at the moment. Low returns, so non-market rate. In a corporate investor or philanthropist context, I guess we'd be saying that that is, maybe outcomes-based payments, or it's not recouping money if it's underspent, or, different things that we can do with the provision of cash that is not necessarily ordinary. So they're the key investment contributions that IMP see that investors make. And effectively, this little diagram is just helping you understand where you fit based on what kind of intentions you have around the investment. I just thought it was quite interesting to insert here because it speaks to that second question around, what impact have I had as a corporate investor? I think that there's other things, and, if I had a little bit of spare time, I'd probably, try and flesh that out a bit. But I think there's other things that probably can be attributed back to investors that aren't articulated here. Around the time in which you invested. Did your investment, because of the name of your company, lead to that investee being able to attract additional capital? Did the time at which you invested them effectively lead to something that if it weren't for receiving that capital at that time, the whole thing would have fallen over? So there's other things that are there, but there's ways in which to kind of pull those threads out and really try to be more nuanced rather than just saying, hey, what impact is my portfolio having at this sort of top level? Actually, what role have I played as a funder in that? And I think that's really useful and interesting to get into. Okay, so I'm about to go into reporting frameworks, tools for transparency, but I just thought I'd just hold on a second and see if anyone's got any questions. John has long questions. Let me just give me a second, John, to read it. How do you do a changing header? Yes. Yeah, that's very true. John, did you want to unmute and talk to what element of that question I can look at?
Yeah, sure. I work in a couple of spaces, specialist disability accommodation and housing for the homeless. You're looking at 10, 20 and 30-year timeframes to deliver good social outcomes, stable, affordable housing, etc. Housing that's designed to meet the needs of people with disabilities. And right now, if we were to develop a model for private investment, maybe through self-managed super funds and institutional and high net worth investors, and we could say we will deliver 5% for the next 5 years, we would have lots. But you actually need to have it over a 20 to 30-year period. And right now, 5% will look great. In 10 years' time, people might be looking at 10 and 15% returns. So they won't invest now for the unless they have a social conscience component of their investment strategy. They won't invest now to lock into the longer terms that you need for social outcome investing.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's one of the inherent tensions within the impact investment market. And sorry to those of you, this kind of does go a little bit more into the impact investment space rather than into corporate investment. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think you know the answer to your own question, right? It's impact investors that are the only ones that are likely to come to the table in this scenario. And super funds, particularly pension managers, the ones that have the longer term outlook. So I don't know, John, are you based in WA? If you are, it's something I can follow up with you separately.
Yeah, I'm based in WA.
Yeah, great. So the WA Impact Fund, that might be something worth having a conversation about, which has been seeded by WA Super.
Right.
Yeah, we've played a bit of a role in pulling that together. So I might just follow up with you offline if that's okay on that one.
I'd look forward to that. Thank you very much.
No worries. Okay, so I'll jump into, if there's no other questions, I'll jump into the reporting frameworks for transparency. So this is probably one that many of you are familiar with, ESG, Environmental Social Governance. It's effectively, I like to think of it, if we think of it on a spectrum of thinking about social investment that just doesn't really care, doesn't mitigate impact of negative returns at one end, and so the IMP framework, and then the ones that are really wanting to contribute to solutions at the other end. I think ESG is kind of the gateway, right? It's for organizations going, okay, let's have a think about this, and let's maybe be a bit responsible about what we're doing with our cash. Yeah, let's get into the ESG side of things. So I would probably put this in that spectrum in terms of responsible investing, which is great. It's like I don't want to take away from that, because I think it's important to get into. I guess we're just a little concerned with impact investing at the other end. But ESG funds in total at the end of 2016 totaled about 2.5 trillion. And what the framework itself does is effectively organizes different elements into environmental, social and governance, and then has kind of indicators under each of those to talk about whether it's in those areas in terms of an investment. So ESG does, as a framework, probably sit with a bunch of the other frameworks we're going to talk about. Like it's not mutually exclusive. It can layer on top of some of the other frameworks we talk about, and in fact, probably in the same way that other tools and methodologies use that language of outcomes, output, activities, the logic model language. A lot of the other transparency type tools use this ESG type language. The Global Reporting Initiative is a little bit more detailed, and this is something that's been around a little bit, probably longer, a bit more established than a couple of the others that I'll speak to. So what I quite like about the GRI is that it's modular, so you can kind of pull out the bits that work and are relevant for you, and it's got quite detailed standards, which I'll go to in the next slide, around what is required for each of those areas. The areas that they focus on are the universal ones, so looking at disclosure and management approaches, and the foundation of the company, economic standards, environmental standards, social standards. As you'll see, the social standards side of it is, so looking at employment, non-discrimination, child labour is really important. But again, it's kind of at the level of being relevant to the broadest possible international audience. So it's not necessarily thinking about some of the challenges that we might be thinking about in Australia or in WA around, you know, the experience of people experiencing homelessness, or like John spoke to before, specialist disability housing, or you know, probably more detailed type impact areas. So it's a bit broader. Having said that, it's also quite similar to ESG and can be used with ESG. And if I go to this slide, this is the employment standard. And so I'm just trying to show just one element of when you drill down what those standards look like. So employment standard, we've drilled down to disclosure around parental leave, and the requirements are that the organisation reports on the total number of employees entitled to parental leave by gender, total number of employees that took parental leave by gender. There's a whole bunch of other things in there. But I think I quite like it because it's detailed. It's got a little bit of rigour behind it, and it is broadly applicable. But I guess in the sense of thinking about how we make an impact in place in the kinds of areas that we're operating in, it's less relevant, I suppose, if that makes sense. GIRS, or Global Impact Investment Rating System, is driven by, so this GIRS is actually used by B-Lab for B Corporation certification. And it uses the IRIS indicators, and we're going to go through IRIS after this piece. So it's a pretty comprehensive framework that goes through community, environment, workers, and governance. And actually, I should probably step back and explain what a B Corporation is for those that don't know. So a B Corporation is a company, so it has to be a company, can't be a not-for-profit organisation, that is effectively certified by B-Lab to say that this is a company that meets these high standards around, you know, community, environment, workers, and governance. So it's a way for impact businesses to kind of make themselves known, I guess, and have a B Corporation certification attached to them. In other jurisdictions like the UK and the United States, they actually have a B Corporation legal structure. And so it can be a little bit confusing sometimes because B-Lab also operates out of the US. So it also has the certification happening there as well. But the legal structure is different to the certification. So the legal structure for over there is a bit more about, it's kind of a social enterprise legal structure, something that, anyway, a whole different story. Come back to the point. The point is that it's a certification process. Impact Seed is a certified B Corp, and we have a few in WA. Beyond Bank is a certified B Corp. Trying to think of who else is. Space Cubed, also in WA, is a certified B Corp. And so is Ben & Jerry's in the US, ice cream. And there's others in WA, just to be clear, and you know, you can find them on the, I'll send a link out so you can check them out. But effectively, it is challenging. Like, and I think the next one I speak to, I thought I was going to speak to our B Corp score and our experience, which I do actually. I just don't do it immediately. So I'm going to go back. So what GIRS does also is percentile ranking. So it benchmarks you as an organisation against other organisations, which doesn't really happen with ESG, really, and kind of, but doesn't really happen with GRI to the same extent. So GIRS does benchmark you against other organisations. IRIS, I know I wanted to kind of take this flow all the way through before I loop back to B Corp, because IRIS are the indicators that are used within GIRS, which is the B Corp certification framework. So GIRS uses the IRIS indicators, so it plugs in. And the reason I'm wanting to talk about these guys in that flow is it articulates how some of these different tools, frameworks, methodologies, whatever, actually can be used together, and they plug into one another with a little bit of work, rather than, you know, being all these different separate things that you've got to wade your way through. So IRIS plugs in to GIRS, and I know there's so many acronyms. GIAN is the Global Impact Investors Network. So IRIS is, I guess, the indicators database for the GIN, the Global Impact Investors Network. And this is a screenshot, and I actually wanted to show you something. Let's see if I can. So this is actually IRIS on on the dashboard on the IRIS system. And so I've just chosen waste management as an impact theme. And the cool thing is that they map the impact theme into the sustainable development goals and some other ones. And I've just chosen this strategic goal of improving sustainability of industrial and municipal water practices. Now, the reason I've chosen that strategic goal, and this shows one of the drawbacks of IRIS, and I think I have it in here, is no, I don't have it. So the drawback is actually that was one of the only ones I could choose. So the IRIS database is populated by people that are using it, and so whatever's in there, it's kind of limited by what's in there, right? I mean, what's in there is limited. That's what I mean. But anyway, if we have a look at this core metric set, so we're in that sort of strategic goal of water. It's ordered into the IMP framework. So you see the impact management framework that we spoke about, the dimensions of impact coming back in here. And then here are the indicators themselves. So these are key indicators. They're consistent indicators that operate across more than just one of these metric areas. And so you can kind of plug and play in a way, right? So within IRIS, you can choose those areas that are important to you, and then you can use the indicators for those outcomes that you're trying to measure. And the benefit is that you know that they're consistent because it's a global database used by impact investors. So you know that they're using those indicators consistently. So that's all I want to share with you on IRIS. IRIS is indicators. And let me bring back my PowerPoint. Oh, there's a question. Oh, yeah. So is it Bertie? Sorry, Bertie. You can tell me if I've got your name.
It's Beata, very close. Hello.
So Beata's worked with B-Corps and he's wondering if the entire B-Corp program is based on this or has additional impact criteria.
Yep.
I don't actually know. I know that ours is based on GERS and that we decided through our B-Corp certification to measure other things that were important to us. But I don't know if that's, I don't know if that's different in other jurisdictions or how that rolls out. But it's an interesting question.
Thank you. I'll look into it. Thank you so much.
Tell us if you find out.
I will.
So I'll go back to present to you guys. Great. Okay, so the IRIS. So I've got a couple of use cases now. So the first of those is SROI. So SROI is a private equity firm. So we've been to a couple of impact investment summits now. And I'm pretty sure these guys were at one of them speaking about their approach around using GERS. And I just really liked it because they spoke about it's kind of like speaking to pulling in what works for you, right? So every fund has its own special sauce in terms of how it measures and thinks about impact. And it is hard for an investor to compare opportunities with any confidence, but that third-party assessment, so being able to use that framework and those consistent indicators was really useful for them in thinking about their portfolio of investment. So it's from a private equity firm. This use case I wanted to speak to is specifically Impact Seed's, sorry. I've lost the chat. So Erin, can you just watch the chat if anyone has any additional questions, because I've lost it somewhere. So in terms of our B-Corp score, so our B-Corp score is actually pretty low. So you have to reach 80 in order to be a B-Corp, and we reached 83.4. I'm just being super open with you guys about this. I think my experience of filling these in, and so the domains are kind of under here, right? Governance, community, environment, customers and workers. My experience of filling this in was that some of it seemed a little bit more oriented towards larger organizations, and we as Impact Seed are still a relatively small organization. And so, they had questions around different kinds of policies to have in place. And I think if you're a large organization, it would make complete sense to have this extensive set of policies in place. But some of them just weren't, we just weren't right there. So yeah, it was a really interesting experience. I think it is really good from the perspective of learning and being able to improve. So we do have what the whole B Corp process encourages you to think about what you might want to have in place for your next round of certification. And so that was really useful. But yeah, I'm just trying to think of other things. We particularly, as you'll see, our governance ranking was, our community ranking is quite high, and but our environment ranking is pretty low. And a lot of the questions around environment related to things like offices, land, plant and equipment, which are things that we do not have. So, I mean, we have a shared office, but yeah, some of those things we just weren't able to, I guess, answer them in a way that was really useful to increase our score. But having said that, we will keep working on it. And I do, if any of you are thinking about B-Corp certification or interested in it, more than happy to talk to our experience a little bit. Yeah, but it's definitely worth having a look at. I think even having a look at the impact areas and the kinds of things that they encourage businesses who are wanting to create impact, those things they encourage you to do, even that's just a really cool exercise to go through, to just think about, yeah, like if I wanted to improve my practices around, community or customers or environment, what is it that the B Corp asks their people to do, and how might I think about those in our practice? Okay, so into the last little section around using frameworks to organise. So this is a snapshot from the Impact Investment Group's impact report that they did late last year. So Impact Investment Group are one of our partners in delivering the WA Impact Fund. And so what they've done is use the IMP framework, as you can see, to effectively make comment on each of their investments, and then at a portfolio level, make a comment about how they're going against the dimensions. And as you can see there, yeah, like I think that's quite an interesting way. They've got kind of a bound, an average of where they think their investments sit, and then a bit of a bound within which those investments operate for each of the dimensions of impact. So I think that's quite interesting. And obviously their portfolio is not looking at any companies that are not thinking about mitigating harm. Isn't that interesting? They've got caused harm in there. I try very hard not to use that language, but they've just gone with it. And then IAG's portfolio around avoiding harm and actually contributing to solutions. So their portfolio is sitting in there. They've also then gone on to map their investments according to the SDGs as well, the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll speak to as well. But I just thought IAG's report was a really cool way of using the IMP framework and then using the SDGs to organise and talk about the impact that their investments have made. So yeah, the role of Sustainable Development Goals, I'm sure most of you know what they are. For those that don't, the UN countries have agreed that these are the goals that the world is aiming for. They replaced the Millennium Development Goals, I forget what year, but somewhat recently. But they're quite popular at the moment in terms of organising impact and mapping impact to the Sustainable Development Goals. Very sexy, people like it a lot. So here we go. So here's IIG's mapping to their Sustainable Development Goals. So as you can see, in terms of good health and well-being, they're looking at their healthcare savings from the investments that they've made. And again, as you can imagine, there will be a lot of assumptions within that work, right? If you're making assumptions about the organisations that you've invested in and how they've been able to prevent people from accessing healthcare in whatever different ways, like obviously there's logic behind that and you can find data to back that up, but you're still going to have some assumptions within that. Education graduates, so yeah, you can read that. They've mapped each of their impacts to the Sustainable Development Goals that are relevant for them. In terms of doing that though, practically speaking, the first step is really to understand the SDGs. And I think this is the thing. I've seen some organisations probably just have a look at the colours and the description on the tiles and then endeavour to map their impact to the SDGs. I think it's probably more useful to really probably understand what sits behind those. So each of those little tiles have a series of outcomes it's looking to achieve within that domain area, within that SDG, and then a number of indicators. So again, using the same sort of stuff we've spoken about all through the webinar, the outcomes or strategy, I forget what they call them, strategies or objectives, and then the indicators that help understand those. And those indicators really are the crux of it, right? Like that's how we know if people are making an impact along that outcome or SDG statement. So understanding then the SDGs, defining the priorities that organisations have, and which of those map to those SDGs, and keeping in mind that the SDGs are internationally focused, some of them are less relevant for us in a developed country like Australia. Not all, but some of them are just less relevant, so we're keeping that in mind. Then being able to set goals along the way, understanding what you would like to see in terms of the in terms of that particular goal. So seeing what the indicator is behind it, and knowing what kind of indicator you're going to use, and therefore what kind of contribution you're likely to make to that indicator. Integrating your own measurement framework with the SDG and being able to report and communicate. And all of that only works if actually we've taken the time to delve into what the indicators are that sit behind the tiles of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. There's some really useful resources available to look at how we undertake that work, and I've just popped them as links in the side of the presentation. A couple of other, actually really just one more framework that I wanted to speak to is a whole of sector outcomes measurement framework for WA. So this was a piece of work that I completed with the first phase of the work with the Western Australian Council of Social Service, or WACOS, with the Department of Premier Cabinet, Treasury and Department of Finance. So the purpose of this is to look at how we might be measuring outcomes across government and across community services that government procures. And, you know, I have a hope that perhaps actually it could also look at how it connects with anyone who's looking to create outcomes in Western Australia. So other jurisdictions have similar frameworks to this. And sometimes impact investors have themselves picked them up and use them, the outcomes that are relevant for them. They've used them in their own investment strategies. So I guess I have a hope maybe that we can do that in WA as well. The framework is still in development. So the first phase of development occurred, and then we passed it back into government to continue the next phase of development. But it was a really broadly co-designed process. So across government colleagues and community service organisations, there's a lot of discussion about what the outcomes for people in, like people that I guess we're supporting, that government and community services were supporting. But obviously it's important to make sure that the framework then works for people like us who may or may not be accessing community services. So that's kind of an element that's still, and this is actually an old version of the framework. I'll make sure I give you guys the updated version when I send the slides out. These have been put to one side, and I'm sorry for those that might be from other jurisdictions. I'm being WA centric here. But this has been put to one side. These were the state government's priorities. And so because of COVID, they were popped to one side. There's been a bit of discussion though about picking up a couple of the elements of them that are relevant for COVID. And so I think probably, we'll see these coming back up to be orientation for the state government soon as well. And I mention them because I think that they're useful in terms of if we are thinking as companies and as organisations, if we're thinking about what we invest in, but also what kind of contribution we're wanting to make and measure as organisations, how might we use key priorities that have been put up there by state government to look at how we're creating change across the state. And I'm not going to pretend they're all good. I particularly have some challenges with defining Aboriginal wellbeing as the reducing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody. But I think some of them are really useful kind of lights to orient towards. A BRAT feature in particular, some of the early years kind of indicators and outcomes are useful. And yeah, this is just a snapshot really of how we mapped our priorities into the outcomes measurement framework. And then there was going to be an additional piece of work on that, on pulling in some other broadly, I guess, navigated to or used outcomes into the outcomes framework and our priorities, but that bit didn't happen. But I think that's it. Yeah, so the point I guess I want to make with using frameworks to organise is that there are a bunch of frameworks out there. SDGs is probably one of the most well-known international frameworks, and hopefully soon the WA Outcomes Measurement Framework will be a relatively well-recognised state framework, but there's many others. And so my point is, have a think about how the outcomes and indicators you're looking to create might link with some of those other strategies, because there will be outcomes and indicators that A, people have already created, so you don't need to go through that design process, but B, that others are using, so you can have a look at how we have consistency across understanding impact in some of these areas beyond just one organisation or one sector. So that is probably my last statement on using frameworks, and that's probably it. So has anyone got any questions at all? I do know that that was, you know, super flying by, you know, a flyby, high level kind of thing, but I hope it just gives you a bit of a picture of some elements that you may or may not have been aware of before, and so it could be useful for you in your own practice. Okay, I still can't see the chat and I have no idea why. Is there anything there, Erin, or no?
Sorry, just a lot of thanks.
Oh, great. Cool.
I think people are digesting. I think was good.
Yeah, great. I'm glad. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. I will make the PowerPoint available to you, and I sincerely ask that please fill in. It will only be like a 4 or 5 question evaluation, but please do fill it in because I like to try and practice what I preach. So that'd be great.
Fantastic.
Great. Have a great
Thanks, Ollie.
day.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.